Right, good evening everyone. My name is Sergey Glazer from the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and we're very glad you're here today, braving the weather, braving the elements. At this point, they're all here. We're all glad to see you. So today we have a special event that is organized with the help of the Collaborative Arts Initiative and Rebecca, and Michelle, and the Theater and Dance Department, and also our department. It is my immense pleasure to introduce Dr. Mariel Pettee, who is here with us for the next 2 days. So today, tomorrow, if you're interested, so Mariel is a Owen Chamberlain postdoctoral fellow at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And Mariel is a particle physicist, and she does a lot of machine learning stuff related to particles. So if you're interested in knowing about her physics work, you can certainly come and listen to our colloquium tomorrow in our department. Today, she will talk about her exploits in adventures in machine learning and dance and choreography. So before this, I'll just give a brief introduction. So Mariel got her AB in physics and mathematics with honors cum laude at Harvard University in 2014. In 2015, she got a master's, again in physics, in Cambridge, Trinity College, and a PhD at Yale University in 2021. I was a reader, an external reader on Mariel's dissertation. You're familiar with it. And since then, she's been at Berkeley. And while in Harvard, she was a choreographer in residence, and she's also was a choreographer, director, dancer, and performer, and she uses machine learning as an artistic medium, and as a dancer, she's performed works by Kinetic Arts, Emily Coates, Renee Robinson, Brian Siebert, Elm City Dance Collective, the Bill T. Jones, Arnie Zane Company, Paul Taylor, Urban Bushwomen, Lee Saar, and Jill Johnson. And I forgot to mention that in addition to her postdoctoral fellowship, Mariel is also a fellow, a visiting researcher at the Flatiron Institute Center of Computational Astrophysics in New York City. So with that, for Mariel.
Hey everyone, it's really lovely to be here. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, so it feels great to be back in the South. And I also appreciate you all braving the weather and the tornado. I just flew in earlier today and experienced like the craziest turbulence I've ever experienced on a flight. It was wild. And another reason why I'm excited to be here today is because, as Sergey mentioned, my main discipline is in physics, and I'm currently a physics postdoc researcher at Berkeley. And so I talk about what I'm going to present to you today a lot to scientists. And so I've gotten very practiced at telling scientists about creative work and kind of framing it in a way that connects it to what their interests are. But really, a lot of this work came from a creative impulse, and so it feels wonderful to actually talk to other creative folks. And I'm curious to see what you see in this work, and to hopefully have some time for questions and a discussion at the end of this. So, with that said, I guess you got a bit of an introduction about me, but my work as a particle physicist is based at CERN on the ATLAS experiment. So CERN, you might know, is the world's largest institution for particle physics and for high energy collisions of particles. So we speed up beams of protons at close to the speed of light, smash them together, and try to understand basically what are the building blocks of nature. So a lot of my day job involves making plots kind of like this one, and working on analyzing data that comes from this massive detector, trying to discover new particles. And as Sergey mentioned, I actually just moved to New York City, so I'm now based in New York, working with researchers at the Flatiron Institute, which is interested in computation and astrophysics, as well as particle physics. So that's a lot of my background, and it's relevant to mention. So this is where I'm coming from at Berkeley. It's this new institute, Machine Learning for Fundamental Physics, which is kind of an intentionally vague title. It's particle physics, astrophysics, and others. And maybe by extending that to dance, I'm really pushing the limits of that title. But what I'm here to talk to you all about today is in some independent research that I've done over the past, 5 or 6 years now, into the intersection of artificial intelligence and choreography. And this has mostly come through the lens of motion capture, so using motion capture suits to actually capture how I move in the studio. And then I kind of apply my data science background to analyzing how I move and seeing if that can influence my choreographic practice also. So to be very clear, we're looking at the intersection of machine learning and choreography. So I like to give a couple caveats before I dive in, because I certainly don't mean to imply in this talk that what I call dance for myself is like dance broadly. So I want to make it very clear that the project that I started really started as just a personal curiosity and a personal investigation into how I move. So I'm interested in my own data set, and I know that that doesn't apply to, and I'm not actually interested in defining what choreography looks like in general for a machine learning model, but I am interested in seeing if machine learning can tell me something about myself and about my own personal practice. So I thought I would just flash a couple elements of my own personal practice and ways that I've come to think about dance and choreography and how that's shaped the way that I move. I won't read all of these bullet points, but basically coming from a Western, contemporary, modern, postmodern kind of background that's interested in improvisation and in genuine relationships between other dancers and in forcing yourself to sort of get outside of your comfort zone by solving puzzles on stage, in a sense. And another caveat that I like to start with is also making sure that I'm clear that I'm by no means the first person to think about using technology and dance together. And something I've appreciated about this project over the years is that in a way it's kind of in this long line of a very rich history in modern and postmodern dance in particular of incorporating technology into the choreographic routine and practice. Whether that's games of chance and Merce Cunningham, or even Bill Taylor working with motion capture even in the 80s and 90s, to equations and algorithms and more to generate dance. So it's certainly not new to the dance world to think about using technology in that work, but I hope to see this as kind of in that line of thinking in this field. So I'd say that the initial seed of curiosity for this project, which I really thought would be about a month-long endeavor that has now stretched out into 5 or 6 years of my career. Research projects have kind of a tendency to do that, right? It kind of is summarized by this quote by Pina Bausch. I didn't want to imitate anybody. Any movement I knew, I didn't want to use. So I was really just interested. I noticed that when I was improvising in the studio, I had certain fallbacks and certain patterns that I would tend to do in the studio. And at the same time, I was using quite a lot of machine learning in my physics work. And I was interested in seeing if machine learning could possibly help me get out of kind of a creative rut in terms of my improvisational style. Or at least maybe machine learning could tell me something about how I moved, and maybe that would be interesting to my own process. I really thought that this was maybe a solved problem, that I would do some Googling and find a software package that did exactly what I needed, and I'd play with it for a few weeks and then move on with my life. It's not exactly what happened. And so when I dove into this, I really had no sense of if machine learning was even capable of producing dance or choreography or something that looked like a person. So I had a series of metrics in my head for thinking about what I would call success for this project. And the first one was realism, was really just a sense of, can a machine learning algorithm generate anything that looks like a human dancing? And then if I get to that stage, it would be great if the outputs looked authentic to myself, something that I could kind of recognize myself in. And then kind of extending beyond that, my wildest dreams would be something that would really surprise me and be something that felt like me, but would nevertheless be something kind of fresh and original. But sort of above all of those goals is this idea from Henri Michaud, this desire to move. And so this is one of his paintings, and I put it here because clearly these figures are not all entirely human, but I think what they express is a sense of movement and a desire to kind of move like these figures do. So I was more interested in that kinetic inspiration than in like full realism at the end of the day. Okay, so with that said, when I started this work in about 2017, there was a little bit of previous work along these lines in machine learning and choreography that's relevant to mention. So these are some two works that existed around that time. On the right is a collaboration with Google Arts and Culture and the choreographer Wayne McGregor, where they actually went through video archives of his choreography and extracted movements from his dancers, and then trained models to generate movements that sort of looked like each of his dancers. And then on the left is a recurrent neural network, a kind of machine learning model that's designed for time series data sets that's trained on basically like an Xbox kind of camera, Kinect camera, I think it's called. So it's a single camera setup from the front. It produces pretty smooth movement, as you can see, but it struggles a bit with when you rotate your body, and if a part of your body is occluded, it struggles with reproducing some of those joints. So I'd say that both of these, because they were captured either from video or from this Kinect camera, had some issues capturing three-dimensionality of that movement. So we can contrast this with the quality of the motion capture data samples that I was able to take at Yale at my PhD institution. And really, I gained access to this motion capture studio through pure luck. They had just installed it and were looking for folks to try to figure out how to use it, basically. So I volunteered and got access to this really nice data set. And you can see kind of the setup here. So it's actually 20 different cameras that are placed in an oval around the ceiling on the top of the room. So they're capturing many different angles of my body. And I'm wearing this kind of classic motion capture suit with basically very reflective, soft, squishy ping pong balls all over my body. And there's 53 points that are captured on my body. And the software has some pretty nice interpolation, so even if I'm rolling on the floor, the software has a sense of where those points on my body are, even if the cameras can't pick up all of that data. So after collecting this data, I ended up leading over the next couple of years two or three independent research groups to analyze this data set by developing some custom machine learning models. And so I'll talk about a couple of these, but the two main ones that I'll talk about today are variational autoencoders and graph neural networks. So I'll start with this first project. This is the first team that I assembled at Yale. Kind of a scrappy, interesting crew from colleagues at CERN, Chase, who was a physicist and a postdoc at the time at Yale, along with folks from the digital humanities, as well as a couple of my friends from the dance world who were choreographers thinking about how technology could influence their own practice. And together we published this paper in 2019. That was our first effort at creating a generative model to create choreography based on my data set. And I won't dwell too much on the models. Of course, if you have questions about them, I'm happy to dig into the details. But I think what you need to know about this model is that it is a form of compression. So it's learning a compressed representation of a movement phrase of about 5 seconds of movement at a time. So it's almost like it's learning how to represent my dance in a much reduced dimensionality. And once it learns how to do that, then I can give it a new kind of vector in that reduced dimensional space, and it'll generate a new phrase. So it learns a mapping from a handful of numbers to a 5-second long sequence of human motion, which is an interesting problem. So that's where the machine learning really comes in, is it's learning this compressed representation of my dance. And kind of a nice side effect of this that I've gone on a couple side projects with is thinking about this compressed representation of my dance, because as you can see, it sort of results in these very beautiful, coherent squiggles, elegant patterns. Like this is what the model sees basically when it sees me dancing. So it's been interesting to think about, is there, we struggle in the dance world to find ways of really capturing and preserving our movements. And I've wondered for a while if I can think of these as like a crystallized version of my choreography throughout time. Oops. Yeah, so let me show you what some of the generated outputs actually look like. This is when I sort of randomly sample from the model. If I try slideshow, let me see if it'll work again. It looks like it works this way, so I'll keep it like this for now. So when I randomly sample from the model, I end up getting a lot of movement that actually looks fairly realistic, like a human. Moreover, I think it also looks somewhat authentic, looks like something that I would have done in the studio. And in some cases, it feels surprising, although some of the movements that I'm showing here are really from kind of the center of the distribution, so they're not too unusual. So I don't know how high they are on the surprising factor to me quite yet. But in order to get surprised, I can ask the model to generate some more unusual phrases. And so that's what I did to generate the following video piece, where I asked it to give me some really kind of wild and unusual movements. So let's see if it works here. Otherwise, I have it loaded up on the next tab. Looks like that'll work. I won't show the whole video, but I'm happy to point you to it. So you can see that kind of unusual to the model means quite a few different things, and we can get into that later on, but it means anything from a kind of like a large movement that maybe is rarely seen in the data set, or it might mean that my head gets 5 times as large, or my body parts kind of like are warped, and or it might mean that it looks like my body is like teleporting and there's like quite a lot of noise. So it's interesting seeing that there's not a single definition of unusual according to the model. There's sort of many directions that can take. So of course, I was interested not only in the machine learning component of this, but also in putting it on its feet and actually seeing what implications it has for performance. So these are a couple photos from a very early version of this model where I actually was only able to generate 1 point at a time. So the prompt that I gave my dancers here was to follow this generated trajectory that you can see kind of in the back of the screen. And that was mapped onto our torsos. And so we were improvising based on the trajectory of where our torso should be in space according to this model. So that was like a very highly reduced version of this, and probably easier to follow in real time than actually trying to imitate everything that a full dancer is doing. Later on, I was also able to work with my collaborator Raymond, who's a really beautiful dancer, to actually be in the motion capture suit, sort of talking to the model in real time. And so what you can see here is he's improvising in the studio, and he's getting some information from the machine learning model projected onto the screen. In the very leftmost panel, it's a little faint, but you can see it very clearly here. He's getting a sense of where in the latent space, which is sort of the machine learning model's representation, where, according to the machine learning model, his movements lie. And so his choreographic prompt is to try to figure out how to explore that space as much as he can, how to surprise the model, and how to stay in one place as best as he can. So there seemed to be sort of one obvious way of using this model, which is generate a new movement. But I found with my team that there were actually many different ways that we could apply the same model that we had trained in order to generate movement. So one really fascinating way that I ended up falling in love with was looking at how to use the model to create variations on existing phrases that I had already created. So I've created a cartoon of sort of what that looks like here, where I've plotted 2 different movements that the machine learning model tells me are close together in space, so it sees those as highly related, even though they are generated separately. So you can see that the idea of closeness here, it does kind of indicate that there's some similarities between these movements, even though it might not always be the same kind of similarity from phrase to phrase. But maybe in the top two, I'm have many limbs on the floor, it's kind of low to the ground, whereas in these bottom two phrases, there seems to be similarity in timing, maybe of how I'm moving from the ground back up to my feet. So it's playing on this principle that the machine learning model sees, it ends up grouping phrases that it sees as similar as close together in its own representation. So the way that I play with this is I take a real phrase from my actual motion capture data set. So that's what you see plotted in black. That's my real data. Then I ask the machine learning model to give me its best version of that phrase. And that's what you see in blue on the very far left. So just looking at the very far left sequence, you can see that pretty much the model has captured most of the important kinematic qualities of this phrase. It's sort of understood it fairly well. Now, if I ask the model to instead give me a phrase that's like a little bit nearby that representation, it'll give me a phrase that's highly related, but is nevertheless distinct from that original phrase. And so you can start to see some very subtle variations, like here, at the very end of the phrase, there's like a little bit of a rotation that I'll point out in this middle phrase right there. And then on the phrase on the far right, the phrase starts to deviate even further from the original data. So this is really fun to play with. It's almost like having someone imitating me in the studio. And so I like playing with this in the sense of maybe I have some real phrase that I really like that I want to experiment with. I've chosen a very simple one here just for illustration. And I can ask the model to give me a couple different options of what it sees to be generated phrases that are nevertheless related to that original idea. And I've found it interesting to sort of really dive into this and try to convince myself, do these phrases feel like the same choreographic idea? Or do they just share timing? Do they just share something in terms of their positions? Or is it possible that it could be different versions of the same choreographic intent, just expressed in a couple different ways? So I don't pretend to have the answer to that, but I'm curious to know what you all think. And so it's been using this concept of creating variations on real dance data that early in the pandemic, I generated a duet with myself using this model. So that's what I'll show an excerpt from on the following page, assuming it cooperates. Thanks. The last thing I'll say about this model, this generative model that I trained, is that kind of a really exciting and unexpected development that's come out of it is I was contacted by this PhD student in physics at UC Santa Barbara who found out about this work and kind of wanted to launch into it for her own physics PhD research. And she works for what's called the BioShape Lab, and they are interested in computational representations of the human body. So she comes from a dance background and was able to kind of sell her advisor on the idea that really this is a computational representation of the human body that combines machine learning in an interesting way. So I ended up collaborating with her and her advisor, Nina Mulan, at UC Santa Barbara, and they recently released this paper. We recently released this paper together that's an extension of this model that I just showed, except that it is a conditional machine learning model. And so what that means is that it takes a little bit more of an input where you can steer it a little bit more clearly. So in particular, you can train this model with labels, and the labels can describe something about the qualitative elements of the movement. And what Mathilde did is she used elements from Laban notation to describe various qualities of the movement, like smoothness or intensity or energy. And so she went through my data set and actually labeled different qualities in terms of how much energy I was expending during the movement in order to create a model that could be a little bit more tunable in terms of what kind of qualities do you want to exaggerate or not. So it's cool to see that this has its own kind of new direction, going towards making this actually more practically usable for choreographers, thinking about what choreographers actually want and need when they might think about incorporating machine learning into their practice. Okay, and then I think I have time to talk briefly about this other project. So after I did that initial work, I was an intern with Intel's AI department, and together with these fabulous researchers who I've listed here, we were thinking about ways to extend this work. And in particular, I was really interested in thinking about not only the problem of generating new movement, but also in understanding how I move, and thinking of the machine learning model as kind of like an external alien eye looking at my body, seeing relationships between different parts of my body. And what I really wanted to know is, what did this model notice in terms of connections between different parts of my body? And did that actually line up with my own understanding as a dancer of what relationships in my body are important for initiating movement? Because of course, I have a sense of how I generate movement, but there's kind of that idea of listening to yourself when you're recorded, where you're like, that's really what I sound like? Like, I wondered if this machine learning model would tell me really what connections are driving my movements. It's interesting to think of this as like an external truth, or to what extent that's actually correct. So we extended this generative model that I just showed you to a graph setup. And what I mean by a graph here is a collection of points and then edges, which mean relationships between those points. So often you see graphs used to describe like social networks, for instance. And so we were applying some of those techniques for analyzing social networks, or maybe for clouds of particles, for instance, but instead thinking of my body as a graph. And so the challenge for the machine learning model was, given the points of my body, could it tell me what relationships it noticed and what relationships were important? And the model that I set up, again, I'm happy to get into more details later, so I might skip some of the finer details here. But basically, the core idea is inspired by this other model called neural relational inference, which is trying to learn an interaction graph where, say you have some planets that are swirling around each other, but you don't necessarily know how they're related. You want the model to give you a sense of how many points, how many planets there are, and what relationships do they have with one another. Maybe there are some that don't have any relationship, maybe there are some that are like connected by a spring force, or maybe there are some that repel one another, that kind of thing. So I was interested in seeing if a model could identify what those relationships actually were. And this is kind of the structure of it. So it saw my same input data, but instead in its internal representation, it no longer thinks of my movement as just a point. It thinks of my movement as a series of connections. And so it identifies which of those connections are most useful for predicting what should happen next. Okay, and then I'll just share some of the more interesting results that came from this model. So these are visualizations of the top 4 types of connections that the model identified in my movement. So the first edge, I have asked the model to sort of put all of the relationships in my body that are not really that important. So what you're seeing are like the most representative edges of a category that isn't that useful. And you can kind of see that it's sort of a random assortment. These pink edges don't really have a clear pattern. But the remaining 3 edges are meaningful. And I was fascinated to see that, for instance, edge type 2, which is in blue, all of these edges originate in my right hand, so they're directed. So they start in my right hand, and then they extend to my left foot. So it was almost like the model had kind of understood something about opposition of arms and legs and something about my training. And I found this very shocking. I sort of expected the model to basically pick up on my skeleton or something about my physical body structure. But instead, it was really noticing these like very disparate relationships between different parts of my body while I moved, which I found totally fascinating. Or edge type 1 in red, all of these connections started in my left hand and then connected to different parts of my upper torso. So there's something about how my arm was affecting the rest of my torso and my chest, for instance, while I was moving. So together with those researchers, we published this in 2020, thinking about learning this graph representation of a dancing body. And yeah, I wish I had like a performance to show you for how we applied this model, but I created this in about 2020, so I really didn't have access to dancers or to dance studios for a little while. So I made a TikTok account, and I ended up playing with some of these edges and trying to see if it would change the way that I improvised while I was waiting for my laundry to dry or while I was writing my PhD thesis. So on the left, you can see an example of one of these really highly ranked connections in my body. So this is what the model told me. This is a relationship that's really important for how you move. And so it was a relationship between the top of my head and my right wrist. And so I was playing with that relationship, and I found it to be really juicy and generative and natural and fun to play with. Then over here on the right, I played with what the model told me was the least important relationship in my body while I was dancing, which is between my left toe and my left knee. And it's really hard to play with that connection because there's a bone that's between those 2 points. So I found this to be pretty awkward, and I sort of generalized it to like a relationship between feet and knees more broadly because I didn't even know where to start in terms of varying the length of my leg, basically. So anecdotally, it also felt like some of these connections that the model told me about did actually reflect something about how I actually created movement. Great, and then I'll spend the last couple minutes of my talk just sharing some reflections more generally about this process of working with machine learning while also being a creative type interested in performance and interested in humans and not just in the technology. So often I get the question of like, how would you use this more generally? How would you use this in choreography? And I give a couple examples that I think I've learned where I really thought that this first bullet point would be kind of the end of the story with this project. I thought it was just about generating choreography. And I hope that I've convinced you that kind of along the way, I was opened up to all of these other possibilities for how to use the model that went more into the area of co-creation, of like talking to a model and seeing what it noticed, and then maybe I talk back to it and we create a conversation. So there's a couple different ways that I've thought about those relationships. And then lastly, I guess I didn't really talk about this at all, but I started to sort of think of these trained models as a form of choreographic preservation, thinking about, instead of only thinking about looking at video footage of myself dancing, I kind of like the idea that these models, I can kind of constantly sample from them and generate new material. So it's a metaphor, but in a way, it's almost like they capture something about my creative potential with the body that I have at this moment in time. And it's interesting to think about training other iterations later on in life and seeing how my choreographic practice changes over time. And then being able to continually choreograph with those bodies, even if I'm like old and injured and can't use my body in the same way, for instance. I found that in terms of collaborating directly with machine learning, that sourcing the data myself has been this really crucial part of the whole process, because really it's a process of investigation into a data set. So I found that it really mattered quite a lot that I cared about the data set and that it had implications for me, as opposed to just being scraped from the internet. And I mentioned a little bit about how I've thought of these trained models as these somewhat precious forms of creative documentation. I've also learned, and this is something that we don't get in science, is that when things go wrong, it can be delightful. This is what I love about creative research, is like accidents can be so generative and useful. And this doesn't often happen in science. Rarely it does, but we don't usually get it so much. So I'll give you some examples of some glitches that I found along the way. That they can just be kind of mesmerizing to look at, they can be funny. They really like, you can get anything from these types of models, right? They really kind of expand what you even think of as being physically possible. They can also just look kind of beautiful. So this is an example of the graph neural network when it was in the middle of training, so it really hadn't kind of figured out the problem of how to represent my body. And an effect like this is something I could have spent hours trying to code by hand, and instead the model was just kind of converging on this naturally. So I like that as one kind of takeaway in creative research, is that mistakes can be useful. Great, and then my last slide here is what I want to leave you with. This is something I've developed, which is a way of talking about my relationship with the model. And I found that there's kind of many different ways that I can talk about what that relationship feels like as a creator. And so I've sort of created these two axes. The x-axis is whether or not I think of the model as my friend. And that could either mean, like, the model being my friend is clear, it's helping me, but the model not being my friend, maybe it's just separate from me, or maybe it's explicitly antagonistic and trying to like push me in some way. And then the y-axis is who's making the creative decisions. To what extent can the model have creative decision power, or on the bottom, am I making the creative decisions? And I think I found that my project has spent some time in each of these different quadrants along the way, going from just automating my practice of generating new movements to creating like a mountain of output that then I as the creator, I'm like picking my favorite movements and stitching them together. Or thinking of it as like a personal trainer or an outside observer who's giving me critique and feedback about how I move. Or in some cases, sometimes it feels like I'm witnessing the model having its own kind of creative experience and generating its own response to my own movements. So I think I will end there, and I'd be happy to take any questions and have a little conversation. Thank you. I guess we're in a small enough room that if you have a question, hopefully I can hear you, and I'll repeat it for the crowd. Yeah.
So have you thought at all about like enforcing some sort of physical constraints on the model to make it conform to the shape of a body?
This is a great question. Yeah, what kind of constraints do I ask the model to fit within? And in fact, early on in the process, I did have a constraint where I asked it to, I basically gave it a penalty if the generated movement, if the skeleton lengths deviated too far from my actual frame. And then I actually took that penalty out, because I think I don't know, I mean, my impression is that some of the most delightful outputs are the ones that kind of break the skeletal rules. So I found that I was very interested in seeing the weirdness of what the model could create. And definitely one form of weirdness is by keeping the body shape the same and then just innovating in terms of the movement itself. But I found it very exciting and kind of delightful to look at these unphysical practices and to imagine, is there a point where these movements become dangerous for a dancer to try to attempt? And I just became sort of interested in that whole realm of questions. Thank you. Yeah.
I was interested, so you were generating the duet, and I was wondering how do you translate an idea of duet for machine learning, or what kind of parameters what defines a duet for the purposes of this
I love that question. Yeah, the definition of a duet here. Right, because the machine learning model is generating movements that are sort of conditioned on a certain movement that I've chosen, but it doesn't have a sense that it is dancing with something else. So I definitely overlay dancers in a suggestive way where sometimes it looks like, I can fool myself into thinking that there's a relationship there, even though really there isn't. Like my favorite part of the duet, you might have noticed there's a point where I'm just standing and the generated output is sitting on the ground looking up at my real data. And they sit there for like a few seconds. It's a really beautiful moment. But of course it's meaningless, right? Like the model doesn't know that that was a sublime element. That was just magic behind the scenes. So I love the question because really my dream is to start analyzing real duet data next and to think about working with data sets from two different dancers so that way the model does have a sense of how do two different humans have a relationship with one another and how do you extract those relationships. So that's, in terms of the computer science element of this project, that's absolutely where I want to go next.
Can I have a follow-up?
Yeah.
Is that allowed? So is there any idea of contact? Because at least, sorry, I'm not a dancer, but the idea of contact, touch, and duet seems pretty important. And is there any way of allowing the machine to imagine moments of touch or contact there?
Yeah, right. It begs the question of like, what data am I actually collecting to capture the dance? Because it's fairly limited, even though it felt more sophisticated than what I'd seen before. Even 50 points on the body is really very limited. And it doesn't have a sense of force or pressure. So it's something I've been thinking about. So one of my collaborators on the first project, Ilya, runs a partnering lab. And he is interested in working with technology like gloves and force plates to actually get a sense of what pressures two different dancers are exerting on one another that aren't necessarily visible to the audience, but are nevertheless crucial to the actual duet. So in thinking about how to extend this work for duets, I think I would like to try to play with these gloves that he works with that capture some of that force data as an external input or as an additional input. So the model has a sense of at least a couple of touch points, but I don't know how to extend that to a full body suit. I mean, it starts to get like sci-fi technology land. But hey, maybe we have haptic suits that do that. And if anyone wants to give me one, please, that would be great. Yeah.
I was wondering how, like, you talked a little bit about how it was received in, like, the medical, like, physical, like, world, but how have dancers and choreographers been taking this? Has anyone been implementing it?
Yeah, about how the dance world is receiving this. So I find that when I've talked to dancers and choreographers about this project, there's a subset that think it's fascinating, and it's the subset that already is interested in technology. But broadly, I definitely don't see choreographers feel threatened by the idea of AI choreography, right? I mean, the dance world is quite analog in many ways. Like we teach choreography by looking at like VHS tapes where the audio doesn't totally line up, and by talking to dancers who have actually worked with the choreographers. And the times that I've learned pieces, like with this project we did a few years ago, we were learning this Paul Taylor piece from 40 years ago, where learning the dance also meant learning about the dancers and their personalities who actually originated the role. And that's something that AI is like never gonna capture, nor should we want it to, I think. So that's why I try to be careful to frame it as like, it feels like a very personal project because I'm so between these worlds of technology and dance that I do think it authentically captures something about the way that I actually think about my body. But I think it's true that for most choreographers, I don't know if they see immediate utility in this. I do think that's why I'm excited to start working with this group at Santa Barbara, because they are researchers who nevertheless come from a dance background, and so they do have a sense of what choreographers might want. There are some machine learning researchers who publish generated dance that choreographers like don't care about. It's what they call dance is the idea that you have to be like synchronized to a beat, and that's all dance is. So I find that there's kind of a big gap in an understanding between the technology world and the dance world about what a dancer might even care about. Whereas maybe they have a better sense of like what painters would care about or musicians would care about. There's this big blind spot for what dancers care about. Thanks. Yeah.
Kind of jumping off Misha's question, so I'm like a chemical engineering dancer, so I love this kind of intersection.
Awesome.
Have you ever connected any of the work you do in your primary, you're already transdisciplinary here, but in your primarily physics role, like inspiring choreography from the collision of particles that would obviously be like obliterated human, right? So in general, applying some of the concepts that define physics, or I think a lot about molecules and their interactions, like, you know, you can't trade an arm from human 1 to human 2, but can you transfer parts of those elements of individuals to one another? These kind of transfers of energy, or the constraints of science in influencing the choreographic.
Yeah, what a fun question. I would love to know also what you're working on too. Yeah, so this has definitely influenced my particle physics work. Like the graph neural network project that I did here predated some work that I did with graph neural networks to analyze particle physics. So it was very useful in terms of like exchanging that familiarity with the tool. But I don't know, particle physics data is different from dance. It's not really a time series in the same way usually, because we have these events that are distinct and they should be, for the most part, completely unrelated to one another. So like a particle physics collision, I don't think of as being as directly correlated to like a time series data set like the one that I'm showing in such an easy way. Nevertheless, there have been some really cool models developed for astrophysics that look at time series data of planets and stars and galaxies swirling around one another, where I think the application is a little bit more direct. And I think I even have a slide on this, but I think I skipped it. Yeah, I have it here. So this is some work by some folks at the Flatiron Institute who I've just started working with, where they basically kind of do the same idea, where they're learning a latent graph representation to represent some dynamic series of points moving in space. And so they do this for a very simple simulation of particles, where you might have some springs that are connecting those two particles. And yeah, you probably can't see from there, but there's a little equation over here on the right where they're able to kind of relearn Hooke's law that demonstrates relationships between points connected by a spring. So they sort of go a step further, where they extract an equation to represent what relationships the model picked up. And then they extend that and they apply it to this simulation of dark matter distributed around the galaxy. And they're able to extract an equation that predicts the density of dark matter better than the machine learning model itself. So I think this gives me hope that there's some ways to sort of directly use, maybe not particle physics data, but maybe, I should still think about it, but at least astrophysics data, because there are quite a lot of similarities between these disparate data sets, totally. Yeah.
So in the slide that you showed where you have the original movement and then some slight variation in the latent space,
Mm-hmm.
It seemed almost like it was sort of a common core movement with some added like flair. Have you done any like searches in the latent space to see if there's like some axis that corresponds to a particular type of flare, so you could add a desired specific movement?
Yeah, this is a great question about the latent space, right, is like the model's internal representation of my data. And the question is like, to what extent have I dug into what the model has understood? Like, what do each of those dimensions in the reduced dimensional version of my dance actually represent? The problem is that my latent space has a dimension of 256. So there's a lot of dimensions. And to be honest, I was like daunted by it, so I didn't go in. I also didn't spend too long trying to reduce that data set, but if you think about it, it's kind of a high dimensional input with 53 points. 5 seconds of movement at 35 frames per second. So it's a fairly high dimensional input. And so 256 felt pretty reasonable for a compressed representation. Yeah, but I haven't done a deep dive into seeing if like maybe there's some axis along those dimensions that correlates with time or correlates with maybe like my height off the ground or jumps or something like that. I think the dream, yeah, would be to try to find something with fewer parameters such that I can actually try to learn something about the internal representation of the model. Yeah, but so far, not yet. Yeah.
You mentioned that your success might be helping pull you from improvisational role. Has there been anything that has adjusted your creative process that you've learned from your experience?
Yeah, this is a great question because I started this talk by being like, a success metric is that it like makes me want to dance. And I think actually, if I think about it, this project has made me spend more of the past 5 years on my laptop than in a dance studio. So it's definitely extended my like broader creative practice in this cool way, but it didn't have the immediate implications that I thought it would of just like giving me new, fresh material to work with. If anything, it took me away from classes that extended my dance capability. So I've laughed about that a lot because in some ways it's a total failure along those lines. Because I look at dancers like this and I want to watch the animation. Like I don't even want to dance, like I just want to watch them dance. And I don't even think of it as me even. So I found that I get sucked up into this world, but I get the opportunity in a couple months over at Amherst College on the East Coast in Massachusetts. I'm working on a new piece that will be a debut of the choreographic debut of this, of basically putting it on stage with dancers. And so I'll be teaching other dancers these movements and constructing a piece to highlight those movements there. So I'm really happy to finally get the chance to put that together because it will bring me out of my laptop and back into a dance studio where I think this work belongs. Like that was the original point. And it's led me to all these interesting paths, including here today, right? But it didn't really alter my improvisational practice as much, other than I think maybe the graph neural network example that I showed, thinking about relationships between my body. It also made me think about, like in many ways I kind of disagreed with the relationships that it showed, or I found them, I don't know, almost like offensive. Like, I'll show them again. Like I didn't like the idea that my movements were only defined by like my most external limbs, because a lot of my movement practice thinks about my core, right? And a big problem with the data set that I am working with here, because it's a motion capture suit that's designed for video games basically, is they only have one point to represent your core. So I feel like actually the model had this like really imperfect representation of the way that my dancing body was oriented. So if I could design a new motion capture suit, I would have like many more points in my core, and then hopefully I might see that reflected in where the important relationships are, instead of just the further extremities. It's like internally is where it felt like all the action was, and here I was like, well, this is interesting, but that's not really how I thought that I made movement. Yeah.
I know it's been like talked about in the like AI dance world of combining two different choreographers, but you also talked about how like over time your choreography can change and the way you move. Have you gotten to experience like any like combining like new and old choreography with the AI?
Hmm.
Like network that you have?
It's a really cool question. I mean, I guess, no, really all of this data was collected around the same time. I haven't played around with combining data across time periods. I think it's a pretty fascinating idea, so thank you. I'm pretty wary of like using this model to extract movement from other choreographers' practices. I mean, I think it's clear that I could extend it in that way, but it feels important that I stay within a personal domain as best as I can, for consent reasons and for all these other reasons, right? Like it's a very personal thing to use your own movements. So sometimes people see this work and they're like, oh, we could have a website where you can combine, like, I want like 30% Paul Taylor and like 30% Baryshnikov and like whatever, and you can create like your perfect dance. But that's not where I'm interested in going, at least. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you describe a little bit more of what you imagine doing at Amherst? Will you let dancers look at the model, or will you re-embody the variations from the model and teach that way? And is the source still the same data? Like, imagining the source is still whatever movements you were able to capture in the mocap lab. I'm just curious how you imagine kind of augmenting that, or?
Definitely. Yeah, so far, yeah, it's the same data set that I've been working with that I collected during my PhD years. Now that I'm East Coast based, I'm hopeful that maybe I'll get to augment that data set with some new data. But it's a great question because I'm wrestling with it like on a daily basis right now, is how to translate this stuff onto humans. You saw my kind of flawed version of that, two kind of flawed versions of that, where one was project the animated thing on the back and then have dancers embody that live. And then there's a version of, oh, let's just put the dancer in the motion capture suit, in the motion capture studio in order to sort of get a real conversation going between the dancer and the model. But for this piece, my instinct right now is I want to show the dancers this material and I want to see where they go with it. It's hard for me because I'm so tied to this material that I want to be as faithful as possible. But I think I need to get over that for this piece. I'm interested in having moments that are definitely influenced by the AI, and I think there's going to be moments that are in my own hand choreographically, and I think they're going to be mixed. So I like the idea of having the audience guess, like they're looking at what feels like a regular dance piece, like the technology is maybe not so visible, but they know that AI has been incorporated into the material, and I like the idea that the audience might not know which parts are more AI and which parts are more my own style. Yeah, but I really like performing arts. Like I like live arts on stage. I'm not really that into like virtual reality or augmented reality or really making the technology feel super visible and techy. So my instinct with the Amherst piece is to be as human and organic as possible, even though this technology is nevertheless like a big supporter and component of that. Cool. So I think we're even a little bit past 6, so maybe we should end it there, but I'm also happy to hang out and take more questions after the talk. So thanks so much for your attention.